Good morning, everyone. This is John with Gun.Deals, and I am back with yet another industry update. And yet again, for the third time in a row, it is somewhat dour at the future projections of the gun industry. But before we get into that, while you're here, go ahead and like, comment, and share, as all that is free and does help us out quite a bit. And go ahead and comment literally anything down below. Getting into the news of the day, this is an article that comes from a website.com. Written by Chris Eager. Gun sales fall under 1 million per month for the first time in 6 years. Yes, since the middle of 2019, gun sales have been over 1 million per month, or at least as far as NICS checks goes, and there's a lot of different steps that go into calculating gun sales, which we'll get into in just a minute. That is, if you needed yet another indicator that the market is in a bit of a downturn or a Trump slump 2.0, as many people are calling it. And I'm actually going to say that this is hitting specifically AR manufacturers the hardest, as we've seen Delton and Anderson Manufacturing recently get retired, bought up, moved around, so on and so forth, and many other similar manufacturers are apparently having some troubles as well. Now, like most things in life, this is multifactorial and not quite as simple as blaming everything on the economy or the relative stability in the market, which is actually bad for firearm sales, since, let's face it, panic drives sales in a lot of cases, and we were facing years of record sales, and now that we're kind of past the incident that caused that, let's say, and we're in a bit of tranquility, well, that's actually not quite so good for gun makers. In July 2025, some 1.9 million federal background checks were processed through the Federal Bureau of Investigation's National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or simply called NICS. Now, the real adjusted figure is just under 1 million at 978,000, which is still a big number. Now, keep in mind that that does not account for number of guns sold. So the real number, because you can have multiples on a single NICS check, could be 1.1 million, 1.2 million, somewhere in that range. But the actual background checks for those guns, and of course some of them could be denied, but the actual number for those guns is around 1 million. However, that plus or minus a little bit million number isn't really important on its own, but the important part of that is that it is a 8% drop year over year since July of 2024, which again, you could argue is a little bit more of a tumultuous time. There's a bit of an election going on in the USA, which will help to drive speculation and therefore sales. And this just comes as a bad omen in general for the gun market. We've had certain restrictions on imports, which have squeezed the ammo market, although ammo prices are finally starting to come down a little bit, although that's probably a factor in slightly slower gun sales for this year. Also, as previously mentioned, we've had a couple AR manufacturers specifically leave the market, and the problem with the AR market in 2025 is that it is probably almost completely saturated, and it is almost definitionally the most competitive market, which means it's the hardest market to continue your existence in. When it comes to Anderson and Delton, they have certainly lived in the bottom half to bottom third of the market in terms of price point, and that unfortunately has been dominated, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, by Palmetto State Armory. So it is the most competitive market, and you're competing in the same sector as a much bigger brand that's much more flexible and has a lot more variety in its offerings. Now, to Anderson's credit, they did try to move on into another highly competitive market, that being the Glock clone market, which is dominated also by PSA, Ruger, and almost every company out there has a Glock 19 clone. I believe Anderson called theirs the Kiger 9C, which is essentially, again, just a Gen 3 Glock clone, which they sold for a very low dollar amount and might have actually been a decent firearm overall. But again, they went from one hyper competitive, oversaturated market and tried to claw out market share in another insanely competitive, oversaturated market, and they just weren't able to make both things work. Now, since then, Ruger has eaten up Anderson, which actually works out great for Ruger because Ruger now has a lot more production capability to make Gen 3 Glocks, which they're already doing and doing that quite well, and also making ARs, which hasn't necessarily been their forte, but they have done it for years. If I were to try and predict the future from where I stand now, I actually see the numbers staying about the same for the rest of 2025 and 2026, as we'll have midterm elections, so there could be a little bit of turmoil there and people might be doing a little bit more buying when it comes to guns and ammunition. 2027 will probably be a low point without some sort of major world event, and then 2028, towards the end of the year, you will probably see things ramp up quite a bit depending on how the election is going. Now that's kind of a dour place for the industry, as they desperately need more sales, and I actually don't think that guns is the way to do it right now. We're about to have a complete removal of the tax on the tax stamp for SBRs and for suppressors. So for companies that have real manufacturing capability, you can spin up incredibly cheap components that have very high margins, which is a big problem in the gun industry in general, is that while they might be selling for a high theoretical dollar amount, the actual margin, the profit that they're making off of each individual item, is extremely low. So unless you're pushing out $250 million a year like PSA is, it's very, very hard to operate off of small margins. Suppressors and certain types of SBRs represent a new financial avenue for some of these companies, and again, in my opinion, they need to take advantage of it to survive. Now, yes, it would be a complete gold rush if they were completely removed from the NFA registry, but even with them still being on the registry, a $0 payment and a sub-week lead time is going to be attractive to a lot of people who already have SBRs and suppressors or have been waiting to no longer give the government $200. Outside of the suppressor and SBR avenue starting in January of 2026, I think that companies might also need to honestly bring out new innovating products to market that actually excite people rather than another line of generic AR-15s, because as much as they are America's rifle, as much as they are the best weapon system on the planet, in my opinion, they're just not particularly exciting in 2025. So again, bringing up PSA, they have done a really good job of, one, dominating the budget side of the market, but also bringing out new wacky designs that are just different enough to be interesting while not charging a absolutely insane amount of money. And I really think for a lot of companies to survive in the next 2 to 3 years, they're gonna have to do something a little bit scary and a little bit interesting to maintain relevancy and to actually entice people to buy their generic AR over somebody else's generic AR, and that is to make something new and exciting. Now, I know that that takes a lot of startup costs, there's a lot of risks involved, but the flip side of that, if you don't take any risks, well, then your outlook for the next couple years is not particularly good. If you're already manufacturing something like an AR, well, try and just do that, but in a monolithic new flavor, piston route, whatever it might be. And if you're making a Glock 19 Gen 3 clone, well, try and do something just a little bit different, maybe a new handgun design. But those are my thoughts and opinions as the market sits in 2025, and we'll see how things hold up through 26, 27, until we finally get to a little bit of drama in 2028, and that might wake things up for the industry as a whole. But again, if you're a company who's resting on their laurels, the 3 years is a long time to wait. But with all that out of the way, gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think of all of this in the comments down below, and I will see you in the next one. Peace off.